The trembling in her hands had become a habit she couldn't break, no matter how many times she'd steadied them against cold stainless steel. Ashley Cooper moved through Mercy General's ICU at 0600 hours, though no one called it that anymore, not since she'd traded her dress uniform for scrubs that hung 2 sizes too large, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical song like a swarm of insects trapped behind plastic. Antiseptic burned her nostrils. It always did. She'd learned to breathe through her mouth in these corridors, the kind of small tactical adjustment that kept the past from suffocating her at work. The oxygen sensor on room 312 needed checking. The 4 line in 315 was infiltrated. The monitor in 318 had drifted off its settings. She moved between them like a shadow, present but unremarkable, the kind of nurse staff looked through rather than at. It had been like this for 4 months at Mercy General, the careful invisibility, the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that drawing attention meant drawing questions, and questions led to conversation she wasn't prepared to have. A nurse at Seattle General had asked once, back in 2019, why someone with her hands moved with such precision, why her eyes tracked rooms like she was assessing threats. She'd transferred the next week. Here in San Diego, she'd chosen a hospital far enough from everywhere that mattered, small enough that nobody asked about the previous employment, large enough that she could disappear into the noise of 400 beds and a rotating cast of residents who barely learned her name before rotating out. The nurses on the ICU day shift had developed a particular talent for contempt. It wasn't the crude kind, no slurs, no direct accusations. It was the kind that came from institutional silence. When Ashley entered the break room yesterday, 3 nurses from her cohort had grabbed their lunches and left without greeting. When she'd volunteered to take extra shifts to cover staffing gaps, the scheduler had said, "We'll find someone else," which meant everyone had already discussed her first, come to some quiet consensus. It was fine. Better, even. Silence meant she could work. Silence meant nobody was watching close enough to see what she actually was. She hung her jacket in her locker at 0555, the movement practiced and deliberate. Inside the lining, sewn with precise stitches into a hidden pocket she'd created herself, was a faded unit patch, Delta Force insignia, worn to the color of old denim, from Helmand Province, 2014. She touched it once with her fingertips, the way some people touched holy medals. Then she closed the door and turned toward the wards. Room 347 held Colonel Marcus Reeves, recovering from routine cardiac surgery 3 days prior. His daughter, Marine Captain Sarah Reeves, sat in the bedside chair with the rigid posture of someone trained to wait at attention even while seated. The colonel's left forearm was visible above the blanket, and there it was, her name, tattooed in military stencil font, Ashley. The letters were dark, professional work, the kind of ink you got in Kandahar at a forward operating base when you needed to remember something that mattered enough to carry into your skin. She felt her breath catch for exactly half a second. Then she continued toward the 4 line that needed checking. The colonel's eyes passed over her name tag without recognition. That was the worst part, not that he didn't remember, but that seeing his own memory tattooed on his body meant nothing to him. She wondered if he'd gotten the tattoo drunk, or in a moment of something else, something he'd decided not to examine too closely in the years since. She wondered if the Ashley he'd known was even the same woman standing in front of him now. "Good morning, Colonel," she said quietly, keeping her voice at the pitch she'd perfected here, not deferential, exactly, but unobtrusive. The kind of voice that didn't carry beyond the room. "I'm going to check your foresight." He nodded without looking up from the newspaper Captain Reeves had brought him. Ashley moved to the 4 line in his right wrist, a 20-gauge peripheral catheter inserted in the antecubital space, already showing early signs of infiltration. The saline bag above it hung at the correct height. The tubing was patent. But the skin around the insertion point had begun to swell, fluid accumulating in the tissues instead of entering the vein. She would need to remove it and re-establish access. Standard procedure. Routine. Nothing that should make her hands shake, and yet they did. She was preparing the new for setup, 18-gauge angiocath needle, tourniquet, alcohol prep pad, when Dr. Hargrove entered the room. He moved with the particular confidence of a cardiac surgeon who'd never experienced a consequence he couldn't litigate away. He was tall, the kind of tall that came with wealth and private schools, and he dressed like someone who'd learned that expensive clothes were a kind of authority. His tie alone probably cost more than Ashley's rent. He surveyed the room with the detached assessment of a man accustomed to dominion, and then his eyes landed on her. "Miss Cooper," he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, all contained power, no urgency. "Perhaps you could explain to the Colonel and his daughter why this were infiltrated in the first place." The room temperature didn't change. The monitor didn't stop its rhythmic beeping. But something in the air shifted, the way pressure changes before a storm. Ashley felt Captain Reeves's attention sharpen. She felt the Colonel's eyes move from the newspaper to her face. "The site was patent when I placed it," Ashley said, her voice still level, still unobtrusive. "Infiltration is a known complication of peripheral lines. I'm correcting it now. By failing to assess it properly the first time." Hargrove stepped closer, the kind of invasion that wasn't quite violent but carried the threat of it. "The Colonel is recovering from a major surgical intervention, and we need reliable access. Not adequate access. Not what a floor nurse happens to notice when she finally gets around to checking. Reliable access requires attention to detail that I'm not confident you possess." Captain Reeves shifted in her seat. The Colonel set down his newspaper. Ashley's hands, which had been steady a moment before, began their familiar tremor. She gripped the edge of the forecart until her knuckles went white. One measured breath. Then she continued preparing the new line. "I understand, Dr. Hargrove," she said. "Do you?" He turned to face the Reeves family directly. "I've been reviewing Miss Cooper's charting. She's consistently late with medications. She missed a critical vitals check last week, no note, just an empty time slot where her assessment should have been. The incident reports speak for themselves. These are the kinds of oversights that lead to patient harm. In this case, we're fortunate nothing worse occurred. But I wanted Colonel Reeves and his daughter to understand exactly what kind of care standards we're working with here." The words landed like shrapnel. Ashley felt them strike, and she did not flinch. She did not retreat. She did not look away from the tourniquet she was tying around the Colonel's forearm. Her hand steadied. The tremor stopped. Something else took its place, a cold clarity that came from somewhere deep, from years of breathing under fire, from the particular skill of doing what needed to be done while being evaluated by people who didn't understand what needed doing. She swabbed the Colonel's skin with alcohol. The scent of it rose between them, sharp, sterile, almost aggressive in its clarity. She waited the required 30 seconds for the skin to dry. Then she advanced the needle. The bevel caught the vein wall and broke through. Blood flashed into the chamber. She advanced the catheter and withdrew the needle in one smooth motion, the kind of motion that came from muscle memory and 237 previous insertions. She secured the line, set it, ran normal saline through it to establish patency. Sinus rhythm. The 4 was in. It was done. "There's a meeting after rounds," Hargrove said. "We'll discuss your performance metrics with risk management." Ashley disposed of the needle in the sharps container and turned to leave without responding. She didn't see Captain Reeves watching her hands, the way they'd moved without hesitation, without fumbling, with a precision that didn't match anything about the trembling nurse Hargrove had just finished describing. She didn't see the Colonel's eyes follow her toward the door, his hand unconsciously touching the tattoo on his forearm as if trying to remember something just beyond reach. The break room was empty when she entered at 0700 hours, the fluorescent lights casting everything in the particular grey of institutional buildings. She sat at the single table, her hands flat on the surface in front of her, and allowed herself to breathe. The vending machine hummed its monotonous song. Outside the small window, San Diego spread out in the early morning light, palm trees, distant ocean, the kind of beautiful place that felt hollow when you had nowhere to be in it. She'd chosen this city because it was far enough from everywhere. It had seemed like mercy at the time. 3 nurses entered at 0715, each of them having timed their break to avoid her. She watched them retrieve their lunches and leave without a word, the deliberate silence somehow worse than the conversation would have been. The door closed. The vending machine continued its hum. And Ashley Cooper sat alone at a table in a break room in San Diego, looking at her reflection in the darkened window of a cabinet across from her. She saw the exhaustion there, the weight of invisibility, the years of carrying things that belonged to people who didn't recognize her anymore. She saw a woman who'd remade herself so completely that even the people she'd saved had forgotten her name. And then she felt the single tear escape, not spilling, not breaking, just appearing on her cheekbone like she'd allowed it, like she'd scheduled it into her shift. She let it fall. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with her own reflection. And then she said, very quietly, to the empty room, "I have carried better men through worse." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she stood, discarded her untouched lunch, and returned to the wards. There were monitors to check. There were patients to tend. And somewhere inside her, beneath the trembling hands and the deferential voice and the 2 sizes too large scrubs, there was something that hadn't forgotten. Something that was waiting. Something that moved through hospitals like a shadow, but shadows, when the light changed, could stretch across entire rooms. The medication chart trembled slightly in Dr. Hargrove's hands, though not from uncertainty. He stood in room 347 with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment, 2 attending physicians flanking him like witnesses, and Captain Sarah Reeves in marine dress blue standing at the foot of her father's bed, watching everything with the stillness of someone trained to read a room before reading a threat. The chart was his weapon, dated and stamped, irrefutable in its accusation. Hargrove's voice cut through the hum of the cardiac monitor with surgical precision. "Miss Cooper, can you explain why Colonel Reeves received his 0400 cardism at 0427? That's 27 minutes late." The words hung in the recycled hospital air like anesthesia, meant to sedate any defense before it could begin. Ashley stood at the four-pole, her right hand steady on the infusion pump, her posture already assuming the shape of contrition. She began, "Doctor, I was responding to a code in the adjacent wing," and Hargrove's laugh was brief and cutting, a knife being drawn from its sheath. "I don't want excuses from Nurse Nobody. This is a decorated military officer, not one of your charity cases." The nickname landed exactly as intended, and Ashley felt the weight of it press against her sternum. She said nothing. Did not flinch. Hargrove turned toward Captain Reeves with the confidence of a man who owned the room and everyone in it, his expression arranged into an apology that was really a performance. "I sincerely apologize for the substandard care your father is receiving here. We're actively addressing our staffing deficiencies." Captain Reeves's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, her eyes moving from Hargrove to Ashley and back again, processing information the doctor assumed she did not have. Ashley took one measured breath. Her hand remained on the pump. Then something happened that Hargrove did not account for. Ashley's eyes met his directly, and in that moment, a single tear escaped her left eye. Not from fear. Not from shame. Her hand moved, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her voice dropping to a register that made the attending physicians exchange glances. Colonel Reeves received optimal care within acceptable parameters. The 0427 administration was medically sound. She did not say, "Doctor." Did not apologize. Hargrove's face darkened slightly, a subtle shift that suggested his control was not quite as absolute as he had believed, but he recovered quickly, waving her away with the dismissal of someone swatting an insect. "You're finished here. Step outside." Ashley moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had learned long ago that speed betrayed emotion. She did not rush. She did not slink. She walked. Captain Reeves watched her leave, then looked at her father, whose eyes had never left the place where Ashley Cooper had stood moments before. The next morning, Ashley arrived for her shift 43 minutes early, a habit from another life, another uniform. The staff accountability board hung near the nursing station in its usual place, a laminated white surface where assignments and brief notes rotated daily. But today, someone had used red marker, the color reserved for violations and emergencies. Her name blazed across the board in letters an inch tall: Aide Cooper, written warning, insubordination, failure to follow protocol. 6 nurses stood reading it, their voices dropping into that specific register of hospital gossip, where cruelty disguises itself as concern. Nurse Chen spoke loudly enough for Ashley to hear, her tone pitched to carry, "Can't believe they even hired her. Heard she got fired from her last hospital. Something about stability issues." Another nurse nodded, the gesture small and believing. Ashley walked past the board without pausing, her eyes forward, her body moving like someone passing through a known room in complete darkness. She did not defend herself. Did not speak. Did not even acknowledge that she had heard. Though the silence was its own kind of scream, the sound of a voice being deliberately withheld, compressed inward until it might ignite. By afternoon, the weight of it had accumulated enough that she needed to sit. The break room was empty at 2:47 in the afternoon, a gap between shifts when nurses were charting and aides were repositioning patients, and the space belonged to no one. Ashley sat at the table farthest from the door, her lunch untouched, her gaze on nothing in particular. Then 3 nurses entered, Chen, Rodriguez, and Matthews, their laughter stopping the moment they saw her. They exchanged glances, the rapid communication of a pack making a collective decision. Chen grabbed her food from the refrigerator, said, "Come on, let's eat in the conference room," and all 3 of them left without another word, their departure creating a vacuum that the hum of the vending machine rushed in to fill. The machine cycled through its warming ritual, a mechanical sound that filled the silence like a heartbeat in an empty chest. Ashley sat alone and looked at her reflection in the darkened window beside the table, seeing herself mirrored in the glass, a figure isolated, diminished, a woman eating alone in a room designed for many. She stared at that reflection for a long time, watching the woman stare back, and then she whispered to the empty room, to the window, to the version of herself imprisoned in the glass, "I have carried better men through worse." The words hung there like a prayer no one had asked her to make, a declaration offered to no one but herself, a reminder that whatever this was, this public erasure, this systematic dismantling, it was not the worst thing her hands had ever endured. What she did not know yet was that Hargrove was already several moves ahead, his phone call made that morning before she arrived. His office door closed at 6:15 a.m., the hospital still mostly dark, and he sat at his desk with his computer screen casting his face in blue light as he dialed a number his fingers knew by heart. "Brian," he said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man calling in a marker he had been saving. "I need you to expedite a board review on a staff member. Termination case. I'll send the documentation within the hour." "Yes, I'm quite serious. Within the week would be ideal." He hung up without waiting for Brian to finish speaking, already composing the email that would accompany his carefully curated file of fabricated medication times, doctored timestamps, and the written warning that was now burning red across the accountability board where every staff member could see it and where none of them would defend her. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, while Ashley was still in her bloody scrubs from the night shift, still wearing the physical evidence of the life she had saved, Hargrove was making his second set of calls. His contact at St. Luke's Medical in Los Angeles picked up on the 3rd ring, and Hargrove's voice shifted into the tone of a concerned colleague seeking guidance. "Yes, I'm following up on a previous employee of yours. Ashley Cooper. Registered nurse, ICU background. I'm just calling because we've had some behavioral concerns here, and I want to understand the context. Did you have similar observations during her tenure with you?" He listened, nodded as if the person on the other end could see him, his pen moving across a legal pad where he was taking notes that he would later reference as the documented concerns from previous employer. The man at St. Luke's hesitated, uncomfortable with the leading question, sensing the trap in the phrasing, but Hargrove's tone was so reasonable, so professional, that contradiction felt like rudeness. There was nothing specific, the voice said carefully, but there were incidents. Nothing we could prove, but Hargrove finished the sentence for him. Instability? Reliability issues under pressure. The person on the other end corrected him gently, but it was too late. The seed had been planted, and Hargrove would grow it into something much larger than the truth. By 4:30 that afternoon, a consultant arrived at Mercy General, a woman from an outside risk management firm, here to conduct an objective assessment of the situation. She carried a leather portfolio and wore the kind of expression that suggested she had done this before, that staff members were problems to be solved with the correct paperwork and the proper sequence of interviews. Hargrove met her in his office, and within 20 minutes, he had handed her a folder containing every fabricated medication time, every falsified chart notation, every selective detail that made Ashley Cooper appear to be exactly what he had decided she would become, a liability. The consultant reviewed the documents with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to trust the man handing them to her, and she scheduled interviews with the 3 nurses from the break room, the attending physicians from room 347, and the staff members who had read the red-marked accountability board. None of them would mention what they had witnessed. None of them would question the narrative. And by the time Ashley finally left the hospital at night, still wearing scrubs stiff with Colonel Reeves's blood, she had no idea that her termination case was already being constructed, room by room, lie by lie, that her name was being systematically erased from the institution even as her hands had literally kept a man alive with the kind of precision that most nurses would never achieve. She drove to the cemetery in Mission Hills where Marcus was buried, her dress uniform hung in dry cleaning still pending pickup, and she stood at his grave in the rain, the scrub blood darkening with moisture, her voice barely a whisper against the sound of water falling from a San Diego sky that showed no mercy. "I saved him, Marcus," she said to the granite stone with his name carved into it, to the Marine who had asked her to disappear, to build a new life where no one knew what she had been. "I saved him, and they're destroying me for it." The rain fell harder, and she stood there until her scrubs were soaked through, until the blood was washed away, until there was no physical evidence left of what she had done. "I think I finally failed." The night shift at Mercy General starts like all the others, fluorescent hum, the whisper of ventilators, the soft beep of monitors tracking lives in suspended animation. Ashley moves through the ICU at 2,300 hours with the efficiency of someone who has learned to move through the world without claiming space. Colonel Reeves sleeps in room 412, his broad shoulders rising and falling beneath hospital white sheets, the tattoo on his left forearm visible in the pale bedside lamp, her name, Ashley, rendered in faded ink from a place called Helmand Province. She's checked his vitals every 2 hours for 6 days. She knows the exact timbre of his breathing. She knows his pressure sits comfortable around 110/70. She knows him the way a sentinel knows the watch post. At 0247 hours, something changes. His systolic drops to 90, diastolic to 60. Ashley's eyes catch the monitor before her conscious mind processes what she's seeing. The numbers themselves are a language she's spoken for 23 years, and this language is screaming. She leans close. His forehead glistens with sweat despite the cool room, moisture beading like oil on water. His breathing has shifted, shallow now, rapid, the kind of breathing that means the body is fighting something it cannot see. She places a hand on his shoulder. His eyes snap open and his free hand clamps across his chest, fingers splayed over his sternum as if he can hold something together through sheer will. "Pain?" she asks quietly. "Can't breathe right." "Pressure." His voice is gravel, the voice of a man used to giving orders, now stripped of certainty. "It's like someone sitting on my eye." He stops, another wave hitting him, his jaw clenching. Ashley's hand finds the call button. She does not rush. She does not alarm. Her voice through the intercom is level. "I need the resident in 412. Now." The monitor climbs, pressure 85/58. His neck veins are starting to distend, subtle but present, the kind of detail that separates competent nurses from invisible ones. Ashley has spent 6 days becoming invisible. She has spent 6 days watching Colonel Reeves sleep without recognition. She has spent 6 days swallowing humiliation in a break room while her reputation burned. But her hands know what those numbers mean. Her hands know Helmand Province. Her hands remember Baghdad. Dr. Mills arrives in under 90 seconds, young, maybe 28, still soft around the edges, still carrying the assumption that protocols are written for other people's mistakes, not his own. He glances at the monitor, sees the trend, sees the distended neck veins, sees the muffled S1 and S2 when he listens with his stethoscope, and his face drains of color like someone has opened a valve. "What's happening?" Colonel Reeves gasps. Dr. Mills doesn't answer. His hands hover, useless, over the patient like he's trying to solve an equation in a language he almost remembers. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical dirge. The ventilator in the next room wheezed its rhythm. Pressure now 78/54. Pericardial effusion, Ashley says. He needs pericardiocentesis. Now. Dr. Mills looks at her like she's spoken in code. I've never done that procedure. I need to call the attending surgeon. This is above my. He'll be dead in 4 minutes. The monitor blinks, 70/50. The sound of it, that particular beep, urgent and accelerating, carries the frequency of catastrophe. Ashley is moving before the words finish leaving her mouth, moving toward the crash cart with the certainty of someone who has already made the decision, who has already stepped across the line between following protocol and honoring the oath that lives deeper than policy. Her hands move on their own, finding the cardiac tray, locating the 18-gauge needle with the kind of muscle memory that transcends conscious thought. This is Baghdad. This is a forward operating base. This is a field surgeon's hands working in a place where waiting means graves. Dr. Mills steps in front of her. You can't, he says, and his voice carries the brittle authority of someone who has just realized authority and competence are not the same thing. You're not authorized for this procedure. Ashley meets his eyes. Her voice drops, steady as a metronome. He'll be dead in 4 minutes. She sidesteps him like his furniture. That's when the door crashes open and Dr. Hargrove fills the frame, his face already flushed with rage, his eyes scanning the room and landing on Ashley with the precision of a hunter finding his prey. Behind him, a security guard hesitates at the threshold, uncertain, caught between protocols and something in the air that smells like destiny. Miss Cooper, Hargrove's voice cracks like a whip, step away from the patient immediately. You are not qualified for this procedure. The room goes still. Even the monitors seem to hold their breath. Ashley looks at the display, 65/48. She looks at Colonel Reeves, whose fingers are white-knuckled against his chest, whose eyes are the eyes of a trained soldier recognizing that something has broken and cannot be fixed by willpower alone. She looks back at Hargrove, and in that moment, one measured breath, the kind of breath that comes from having already decided what matters, her voice changes. Not louder. Lower. The voice of someone who has stood in worse storms than this, who has held her composure while the world burned, who has learned that the quietest voice in the room is sometimes the one holding everyone else upright. With respect, Doctor, I'm the most qualified person in this room. She doesn't wait for his response. Her left hand steadies Colonel Reeves' chest wall. Her right hand, steady as a surgical laser, steady as training and muscle memory and 23 years of hands that have held lives together in places that don't appear on any map, moves the needle toward the xiphoid process, angling down and toward the left shoulder, finding the space between his ribs the way a key finds a lock. Security! Hargrove's voice rises to a shriek. I want her removed. This instant. The needle enters. There is a sensation, subtle, almost imperceptible to untrained hands, when the needle passes through the fibrous pericardium and enters the fluid space. A give. A release. Ashley feels it the way a safecracker feels the tumbler turn. The security guard takes one step forward, then stops, caught between orders that are crumbling and something he cannot name. Dr. Mills stands frozen, watching, his mouth open like he's trying to remember how words work. But that wasn't the worst part for Hargrove. The worst part was that she was right. The worst part was that the pressure on the monitor, that impossible, falling number, suddenly stabilized as the needle found its target and gravity did what antibiotics and prayers could not. The worst part was the way color returned to Colonel Reeves' face, the way his breathing eased, the way a decorated soldier's life resumed its rhythm in the hands of the woman Hargrove had spent 6 days trying to destroy. In the hallway outside the room, Dr. Hargrove's phone was already at his ear, his voice dropping to the controlled fury of someone with allies in high places. Yes, I need board members Carlson and you on a conference call immediately. I don't care what time it is. We have a liability crisis. A serious one. That nurse just performed a procedure without authorization while I was standing right there. I have a witness. Security was present. I want this documented and I want her terminated before shift change. He stood in the fluorescent light, listening to the hold music, and smiled the smile of a man who believed institutional power was something that could never be taken away. He was wrong. The needle went in smooth. 14-gauge angiocath, inserted at the fourth intercostal space, just below the xiphoid process. Ashley's hands moved with the certainty of muscle memory, hands that had done this in field hospitals under mortar fire, hands that knew pain was data and blood was information. The colonel's pericardial sac was compressed like a fist around his heart, and she could feel the resistance as she advanced through the fibrous tissue, feeling for the give, the release. Then it came. Dark blood, thick as motor oil, began to flow backward through the needle hub. 120 cubic centimeters of pure darkness drawn from the space that was killing him. The air around the procedure tray seemed to still. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge the on-call resident who had frozen, didn't acknowledge the attending who stood uselessly in the corner. She just kept drawing. 70 cc, 90 cc. 120. Enough. She withdrew the needle with the same steady confidence she'd used to pull teammates out of burning buildings. The monitor responded before anything else did. The blood pressure that had been a dying whisper, 68/30, dropping toward flatline, began its climb. 75/52. Still critical, but rising. The oxygen saturation that had been strangling in the 80s began to climb with it. Her fingers moved to the medication tray, already knowing what came next. The ventilator hissed its mechanical breath. Dopamine. 1.5 micrograms per kilogram, pushing steady through the 4 line. The colonel's color was changing. Beneath the gray, something human was returning. 88/60. 95/64. The monitors beeped their approval. Sinus rhythm. Regular. Strong. The entire night shift had gathered at the glass wall like spectators at an execution that had just become a resurrection. Nurse Chen stood motionless, her phone recording everything, not understanding yet that she was capturing the moment everything would change. The medical resident's face was white, watching a nurse do what he couldn't, what he wasn't trained to do, what no amount of residency could teach. Ashley didn't look at them. She adjusted the 4 rate, checked the output line, and settled into the work of keeping a man alive 1 minute at a time. For 3 hours, she barely moved. The clock on the wall crawled through minutes like it was underwater. 3:07. 3:32. 3:58. She monitored vital signs every 10 minutes, watching the colonel's body stabilize, watching his oxygen saturation rise and hold steady, watching the pressure in his chest finally release. At 0300, his eyes opened. Just barely. She was adjusting his monitor leads when she saw it, awareness returning, consciousness like a light switch being turned back on. His lips moved. His voice was barely a whisper, cracked from intubation, from the ventilator breathing for him. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. Said nothing. There was nothing to say. The gratitude belonged to no one but the man who had chosen to come back. She just continued her work, checking fluids, confirming readings, doing the small invisible things that would keep him on this side of the line. Captain Sarah Reeves arrived at 3:20, called by one of the nurses who knew exactly what had happened and knew exactly who should know. She moved into the ICU like a weapon with permission, marine dress uniform sharp as a blade in the fluorescent light, her eyes scanning the monitors before they landed on Ashley. She gripped Ashley's hand without asking permission, held it like she was anchoring herself. "You saved my father's life," Sarah said. Ashley looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the colonel's eyes staring back from his daughter's face. "Just doing my job," she said quietly, and meant it exactly as she said it. But that wasn't the worst part. By 6 in the morning, as the night shift began its handoff to day's shift, Ashley still wore her bloody scrubs. She'd been meaning to change them for hours but couldn't leave the monitor, couldn't step away. The colonel was stable now, truly stable, his body doing the work instead of fighting it. She was washing her hands in the break room when her supervisor appeared in the doorway like a bad omen. Sarah Morrison, one of the few people in the hospital who'd never been particularly kind to her but had maintained professional distance. Now her face had changed. "Dr. Hargrove wants to see you," Sarah said. "Now." The walk to his office felt like walking through water. The hospital corridors at shift change were chaos, new staff flooding in, night shift bleeding out, the handoff of consciousness from one version of Mercy General to another. No one looked at her twice. Just another nurse in bloody scrubs, blood being the currency of their work. Hargrove's office was on the 3rd floor, corner windows overlooking San Diego's industrial harbor. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded in front of him, and for a moment he looked like exactly what he was, a man who believed his position was permanent, unshakable, written into the architecture of the world itself. 2 board members appeared on his desktop monitor, video conference, their faces pixelated but their expressions clearly visible. Concern. Judgment. The look of people being prepared to witness something they'd already decided on. "Miss Cooper," Hargrove began, and his voice had the smooth quality of someone who'd rehearsed this. "What you did tonight was incredibly serious." Ashley said nothing. She stood in front of his desk, still in her bloody scrubs, and waited. "You performed an invasive surgical procedure without proper authorization. You directly violated my explicit orders to stand down. And in doing so, you created an enormous liability exposure for this hospital." He opened a file on his desk, her personnel file, she realized with a hollow sensation, and he didn't look angry so much as satisfied. "I've spent the last 3 hours making some calls. I contacted San Diego Presbyterian where you worked before coming here. Spoke with your former supervisor. He mentioned some concerns about instability, boundary violations, difficulty with authority structures." He paused, letting that sink in. "I've also brought in Patricia Grant from Risk Management Solutions to review this case." The woman on the monitor nodded. "Professional. Merciless. Based on the unauthorized procedure, the violation of direct orders, and the previous employment concerns, we've determined that immediate termination is the only responsible course of action." Hargrove slid a stack of papers across his desk toward her. "Effective immediately, your employment at Mercy General is terminated. A security escort will accompany you from the building. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file." The words hit her like a punch that had been coming for weeks and she'd finally stopped bracing for. She looked at the termination papers, at Hargrove's face, at the board members' pixelated expressions of regret that felt carefully practiced. Her hands were steady when she reached for a pen. Her voice was flat when she spoke. "I saved a man's life tonight," Ashley said. "And you're destroying me for it." She didn't wait for a response. She signed the papers with the same precision she'd used to draw blood from a dying man's chest, set the pen down carefully, and stood. The walkout was done in silence, Sarah Morrison appearing with a security escort, a man named Rodriguez who looked genuinely sorry about this part of his job. Through the ER at shift change, when every staff member was arriving or leaving, when the maximum number of people would witness the end. The whispers started before she reached the parking lot. She heard them. She didn't look back. That evening, Miramar National Cemetery sat under a sky the color of old concrete. The rain hadn't started yet, but it was coming. She could smell it, that pre-storm ozone smell that meant the sky was about to break open. Ashley knelt in front of a white headstone that read Marcus James Cooper, USMC, 2005 to 2019. Beloved husband. She wore the same scrubs, still stiff with dried blood at the hem. She'd come straight from the termination, hadn't even changed. The rain began to fall, gentle at first, then harder, then like the sky was throwing everything it had at the earth. She knelt there anyway, rain soaking through her scrubs, and whispered words that only the dead could hear. "I saved him, Marcus. I did everything right. I carried him. I kept him alive." Her voice cracked, then steadied itself. "And they're destroying me for it. I think I finally failed." She reached into her pocket and placed something on the headstone, her hospital ID badge. Ashley Cooper, RN. As if that title meant anything now. As if she'd ever been just that. The rain came down like judgment. The rain came down like judgment. Ashley sat in her Chula Vista apartment in yesterday's scrubs, still damp, still carrying the smell of antiseptic and failure. Her phone lit up. Unknown number. She let it ring. Ring again. And again. On the fourth call, muscle memory won. She answered. Senior Chief Cooper. The voice was military precise, female, unmistakable authority. This is Captain Sarah Reeves. Please don't hang up. Ashley's throat tightened. The Colonel's daughter. The Marine who'd watched her father humiliate a nurse in room 347. I've been terminated. I can't come back to. My father is asking for you. There are people here who need to see you. A pause. The weight of command in that silence. You need to be at Mercy General. Right now. Captain, I don't think. That's not a request, Senior Chief. It's from a 2-star general. The line went dead. Ashley stared at her phone for 17 seconds. She didn't move. Didn't think. Just stood, pulled on the jacket with the patch still sewn into the lining, the other one, identical, hidden for 15 years, and drove in silence. Hand steady on the wheel. Eyes forward. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Meanwhile, at Mercy General, the world was collapsing in real time. FBI agent Maria Torres arrived at 0600 hours with a forensic accounting team and a warrant sealed so tight even the hospital administrator didn't know what they were looking for until the first computer was seized from Dr. Hargrove's office. His files. His emails. Everything. Board member Gerald Carlson sat in a conference room, sweating through a linen shirt, when Agent Torres slid a document across the table. Mr. Carlson, you received a consulting contract worth $847,000 from Dr. Hargrove's medical billing company. Can you explain the nature of those services? Carlson's lawyer touched his arm, but Carlson was already cracking. I don't know what you mean. He called me about a nurse, said she was unstable, and I. You recommended her termination based on information you never verified. Agent Torres smiled like a shark. And Dr. Hargrove paid you $847,000 for it. You'll want to contact a better lawyer than that one. 3 blocks away, risk management consultant Patricia Grant was already in her car, already making calls. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel. The FBI had seized everything. Every record. Every referral. Every fabrication. Her voice on the phone was barely controlled. They know. They know everything. Hargrove kept detailed records. At San Diego Presbyterian Hospital, where Hargrove had called to poison Ashley's references, an administrator was watching the news coverage on a break room television when her assistant knocked. Dr. Hargrove called our billing coordinator about former nurse Ashley Cooper. Not anyone in HR. Not anyone authorized to give employment references. The assistant pulled a file. The call logs show he coached her on what to say. The administrator picked up the phone with a kind of deliberation that precedes legal action. Get me our legal team. Back at Mercy General, the ER staff was watching too. Nurse Jen sat in the break room, phone in hand, re-watching the video she'd recorded, Ashley's hands moving like surgical machinery, the needle going in, the blood flowing into the syringe, the Colonel's oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 92 in 3 minutes while Hargrove shouted orders from the doorway. She'd recorded it because she wanted evidence. Now she had it. Nurse Rodriguez whispered to the others, "We left her alone." Every single time, Matthews added quietly. The ER doors hissed open. Ashley Cooper walked in still wearing yesterday's scrubs. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn. Every single person in the ER stopped. Turned. The silence wasn't quiet, it was the absence of permission to speak, the weight of collective recognition of something wrong now being made right. The SEAL commander came first, crossing the ER in dress whites that looked like they'd been pressed with a laser, every movement deliberate and exact. He came to attention in front of Ashley. His salute was crisp as breaking glass. Senior Chief. Ashley's muscle memory was faster than her mind. Her hand was at her forehead before she understood why. Automatic. 15 years of service didn't unlearn itself just because she'd spent the last 6 years trying to disappear. Then Colonel Reeves came through the double doors in a wheelchair, Captain Sarah pushing, her uniform pressed, her bearing identical to the SEAL commander's. The colonel's eyes found Ashley's and finally, something shifted in his face. Recognition. The kind that comes from a moment that changed everything. He raised his left forearm. The tattoo. Ashley. Faded from 17 years, from Helmand Province, from a moment when a senior chief petty officer had carried him 17 miles through enemy fire while his blood soaked through her gear and her hands never stopped moving and she kept saying her own name so he wouldn't drift away. I knew you, he whispered. I was delirious. You kept saying your name. Ashley. 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 Like you were anchoring me to something real. It was you the whole time. Ashley's composure didn't crack. It shattered. One tear escaped before she could stop it. She wiped it away without looking at anyone, without acknowledging what had just happened to her face. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. 17 miles. You were 200 pounds of combat weight and you weren't getting left. Captain Sarah stepped forward with a 2-star general in dress blues who moved like authority, had a physical presence that made the air pressure change. His name was Brigadier General Marcus Webb. He looked at Dr. Hargrove, who was standing frozen in the corner near the trauma bay, his face the color of old medical gauze, and said simply, Dr. Hargrove, you're terminated effective immediately for attempting to destroy a decorated war hero. Security will escort you out. The security team didn't run. They didn't hurry. They just appeared on either side of Hargrove like the inevitable consequences of physics. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Let them guide him toward the exit while every staff member watched in perfect, terrible silence. The SEAL commander stepped toward Ashley, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a 7-layer identity reveal that nobody needed him to explain because the patch sewn inside her jacket lining said everything. The photograph on Captain Sarah's phone said everything. The Navy Cross citation that General Webb was already pulling from his uniform pocket said everything. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, the commander said, earned the Navy Cross in Helmand Province after carrying my entire team, including then Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, 17 miles through active enemy fire. The unit patch sewn into her jacket represents the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Charlie Platoon, Dark Horse Company, the unit she saved. Nurse Chen's phone slipped from her hands. Rodriguez started crying without making a sound. Ashley stood in her scrubs, the one still damp from yesterday's failure, and said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence in the ER was the kind that only happened when the world rearranged itself. 6 months later, the story had a different ending. Dr. Hargrove was selling supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a grocery store in El Cajon, unable to get licensed to practice medicine anywhere in California after the state medical board review. Board member Carlson took a plea deal. Patricia Grant took a plea deal. The FBI's forensic accounting team found 47 separate cases of billing fraud spanning 8 years. Ashley stood on the Mercy General rooftop helipad at sunset, no longer in scrubs. Director of Emergency Medical Services, a position the hospital board had created specifically for her, specifically to keep her. Colonel Reeves stood beside her, fully recovered, wearing civilian clothes and the bearing of a man who finally understood exactly who had saved his life. They watched a medical helicopter lift off into the San Diego sky, rotors cutting the air like purpose, and the colonel said, "You ever think about going back to the teams?" Ashley shook her head. 15 years. I did my time. This is where I'm supposed to be now. You've changed this place, he said. The whole culture. The staff works differently now. Everyone thinks differently when they know a legend walks among them. The helicopter disappeared into the golden light. Captain Sarah joined them on the rooftop, holding a framed photograph, the original team picture from Helm and Province, 2014. Ashley in the center. 7 operators around her. All alive. Thought you might want this, Sarah said. To remember what you're capable of. Ashley studied the faces, the expressions, the moment frozen in time before everything changed. Through the hospital windows below, she could see the break room where Nurse Chen and Rodriguez and Matthews were setting up a birthday cake, trying awkwardly to make amends for leaving her alone. They'd learned it was her birthday. They were trying. She took one measured breath and said to the colonel and captain, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." Colonel Reeves nodded slowly. 17 miles in the dark. You never stopped. Ashley turned toward the stairwell, toward the people waiting below, toward the second chance she'd earned by simply being who she'd always been. The 3 of them descended together, and somewhere in the hospital, a monitor beeped its rhythm and an alarm chimed and voices called out urgent orders, the sound of lives being saved by hands that had learned to save lives a very long time ago, in a place most people would never understand, carrying weight that most people would never have the strength to carry at all. If you've made it this far, you know the truth. The quietest person in the room might just be the one holding everything together. Subscribe for more stories about the ones the world missed. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to.